Welcome, and in this video I'll discuss at some length on the distinctions between the voters, the voting bloc, and why we get the politicians that we deserve. In this episode I will try and cover the reasons for why politicians that do get elected, and that we can consider future politicians to represent certain ideas or platforms and their likelihood of becoming an elected official or taking power accordingly. So I think it's quite good to understand voters along these segments, you might call them, or standard distributions. The idea that IQ follows closely with politics is fairly consistent with the idea that the social axes can be flipped to a conservative and a liberal, or like two arms, so there's going to be a near 50-50 split on almost most grand policy decisions. But in general we can factor in an IQ spectrum across that, so that typically the average IQ for both conservative or liberal or progressive and reactionary, whatever the division might be, tend toward being at least representative of half the population to a certain degree. The most evident example of this is obviously conservatives, Republicans in America, and Democrats, but also you have what was the Tory party and the Labour Party in the UK, and in Central and Western Europe it's particularly difficult if they've got proportional representation, but most parties configure themselves around a central portion of the bell curve from a political point of view. So to say, if this was an axis of very, you might say, conservative versus very progressive, then you'll have a government who's progressive still on the center of the left or the right of that spectrum. If you look at it more of as a four-plane axis, y and x axis, then we can consider in those squares that the groupings of elected officials in proportional representation countries will still represent more or less a congregated and reasonable or timid variation of political positions. So in any case, that's kind of the foundational thoughts that go into describing politics like this, and then for me to generate a visual for you here, we can then dive into exactly what is the reasoning behind certain choices. So the classical notion is that we do get the politicians we deserve, and I think it holds true. It's almost a truism in that you'll find post facto reasonings for why we got the politicians we did in almost every case, and it's very rare that you'll have a left of field power usurper come in and make everyone else capitulate. So typically there are processes involved, and it's quite easy to see the support wane or wax depending on who's involved in the decisions. In say second or third world countries, this typically means that America and its intelligence arms influence the decisions on who's maintaining power and what methods they go about gathering the resources and then taking the power that they have been designed to take, whether that's toppling governments versus supporting coups or what have you. But in the first world, at least, we have institutional democracy, which is representative, and here's how the representation can look like. So I think if you consider the population to be more or less based on IQ, it's a standard deviation bell curve, Gaussian distribution, where by each standard deviation, usually 15 IQ points, you start to uncover the mass psychology of reasoning, and particularly political reasoning. You have very basic wants and needs on this left-hand side, so anything less than 85 IQ is typically swayed with the very basic premise of money. Will someone give me more money? That is a very easy sell. And then you have a little bit around people like us. So I'll vote for someone who looks like me, acts like me, thinks like me in ways that I can comprehend. They also don't typically vote. So unless you have compulsory voting like somewhere in Australia, then it's hard to get these people registered. And then if they are registered, the motivation to vote, because they see it as and probably ironically in a smart way, that it's a wasted effort. And so the hope to garner votes here is done very casually by a political party. They might throw a few bones this way in terms of electing representatives or a vice president, or have interviews focused on a particular representative. So in the UK, they might have the token Chinese or brown or whatever person come out and do interviews for their party, and then they can throw those adverts at certain groups and say, look at us, we're representing you with this person wearing a turban, like you wear turbans. Very effective, but like I said, it's hard unless they actually vote to get that much. So normies probably comprise most of the right end of this spectrum. Anything too close to 80 and below IQ is severely demented territory, so you won't get much out of that. But the typical sway of political decisions can come from, say, 83, 84, 85, and then all the way up to 115. The standard distribution works at 65% of the population, more or less, is comprised in this middle band, and that of that you would assume there's the same kind of difficulty with registering to vote a lot of those less than 100 IQ people. So the motivation flow probably also is a semi-linear function here of IQ. So the smarter you are, the more likely you are to have registered to vote, and then the more likely you will vote. This can also be cofactored to age. The older you are, the more likely you are to vote, because you've got either more concerns, more strong opinions, or you're just bored and you want something to do. Nevertheless, we can think of the followers here as normies or NPCs if you want to be pejorative, but in general I think it's best to not traduce people too much. And their reasoning for their decisions comes down to mainstream media and podcasts. So they get pumped. This is where most of the advertising spending from elections does go, and where most of the polling and the leaflet drops and people with rosettes walking around knocking on doors is targeted towards this very massive middle band, because you can potentially sway 5-10% of this band either way. They're usually dependent or swing voters, and then you can usually, with a good representative, in this case I've chosen Obama because he takes a lot of the people like us. Almost every African person in America would have voted for him, and then you have the white guilt factor, so he probably got another 5-10% there from white liberal voters, but then also having the core demographic of the Democrat Party means he was able to win that election fairly comfortably against no-name Mitt Romney, and then I think who ran in 2008, John McCain. So both of those being fairly milquetoast standard Republicans with nothing to offer in terms of beating and edging out, like I said before, the people like us or the white guilt factor. This is currently how democracy works. It more or less takes a small percentage here, say like 5%, say like 60%, and then the remaining 35% from these three bands more or less comprise what we consider democracy. And if you're going to be elected, here's who you should try to appeal to. We have a transcendent force sometimes, and this is the lightning bolt here, of people like Macron or Donald Trump, where they are, in Weber's typology on power, charismatic men, and for reasons that can be controversial. And this is not to say that I necessarily support them or idealize them in certain ways, but they're able to more or less relate to different segments in different ways because of their charisma or their personality, rather than necessarily policy positions. Now, Macron is also very centralist in his policy positions, with some random issues that he's slightly more extreme on, and then Donald Trump obviously erring on the side of what would be Trumpism rather than any pre-formulaic or considered generic conservative or liberalism. We do have this subsect of IQ and thus what I'd call here policy followers, where people like Ron Paul here try to run on this idea. Now, this is very political naive or gesture type. It's where you get this reluctant politician who says, okay, well now I've got a sliver of power, but I want to influence policy more. I'll try to challenge in ways that are fairly risk averse, I would say. So Ron Paul chimes in on discussions to nudge policy positions certain ways, knowing he won't win. Bernie Sanders also did this, where it's I'm forced to run because the current standards are not sufficient in certain criteria for me to feel satisfied that my policy wishes and wills are going the way that I want them to. They never expect to win, and as Hillary showed, you can't actually win even if you are a outside favourite like Bernie was, because the party mechanisms won't allow for it. They don't want to have extremism for reasons that are fairly obvious to why donors typically favour easy to sway and less ideological politicians. So if you are curious as to why politicians get lots of money, it's because they're easy to buy. It's more or less a one-to-one correlation. This is American politics. It's a little bit harder to buy politicians in other countries like the UK, but it can still be done. You can still appoint and you can still toady to certain politicians for certain reasons to get certain things. So it is possible. Donations to parties, and there's other services provided, and you can always have friendships, etc. But anyhow, so this is that segment called the policy followers. They also comprise democracy. They'll typically have more informed decisions, if not you might call extremist positions. They'll be still very much in accordance with the normies in terms of we need to latch onto an idea or a person in particular, but then slightly more advanced in the way that they argue for these positions. You might say that things like Reddit are the perfect instance of this. And I know there's obviously a ton of Redditors who are not as more than 150 in IQ, but in general, the discussion is more towards an advanced normie discussion, and then policy plays a role. So say, you can't just say, let's nuke Iran. It has to be, we have to deter Iran from certain aggressive policies by showing them arms and force in a way that's deterrent rather than reactive, or whatever the policy position might be in that regard. So this is where you get that. And then the unfortunate part of democracy is all of these people are more or less herd-like and followers in a very real sense, that they try not to stir the pot and be controversial, so their opinions are fairly milk toast and unextreme and non-provoking to society in general. It's very hard to stick out here. You will find that you can be a positive extremist like Ron Paul, where he's very libertarian, which can be considered controversial but not really. People tend to go, oh yeah, okay, he's the kooky free markets guy, but not in a malicious way. And then you can consider most of Trump's positions to be fairly mundane and centered, which is why the extreme version of his hatred comes more from a charismatic personal hatred. People detest him in a way that's very personal rather than policy based, which is the opposite. Everyone thinks Ron Paul's a nice guy. They just think he's a little bit crazy with his free market libertarian ideals. So this is where you get that. And then in the more extreme scenarios you go, so the worse a country gets divided, and this can become apparent in the West over the next 50 years, you start to see, and this is where Caesar figures do come in and play their role, in that when you get a divide so extreme that the control and the systemization of power breaks down, you can realize autocracies or semi-autocracies in ways that allow for more, you might say, propitious conditions for a dictator-like figure, or someone who is in general more of a strong man, a Caesar type. So the first instance I have here is Milei, and he's the type we might call success then politics. And as I said, Trump and Macron also fill this void to some degree. People like Boris Johnson are also in this realm, that they have a name and a regard that precede their time in politics, but also somewhat coincided their involvement in politics. So it was quite known that they would be involved in politics to some degree at some point, and that leadership in the party can be constructed towards their specificity rather than a general, we'll see who gets elected. It's quite advantageous to be this person to assume power but not necessarily hold on to power, because you are so divisive and polarizing that it can be difficult to maintain a voting base in a way that is consistent through, which is also why democracy is not seen as a preferential system if you are a person who's quite strong, trying to be elected on your own merits rather than a party's merits. Starmer, for instance, the Prime Minister of the UK, has a much more stronger normie policy follower brand built on the Labour Party, which ipso facto shows his own brand is more or less it's not no consideration towards his electoral profile, and if anything, now he has his own profile. People don't like him because of how bland and beige he is in general. But yeah, this donor class is what you might call the followers of this realm of intelligence. So the donor class typically is comprised of people who are wealthier and or more connected and or better networked, and will attend events and have the ear to people who maybe speak directly to people in power or are in power. We can think of this donor class as particularly strong with lobbyists in America, and then you might call it the upper class and educated classes of the UK, and then in general the established power bases in continental Europe. So people who have long lineages of political activity and strong roots in certain communities. This party will be this quadrant or segment will be something to look out for, because this is where you'll start to see outgrowths of certain types of politicians, like Javier Milei, if the environments become more extreme. In the West, extreme starts to look like a degradation or a retrograde system of social policy. So retirement ages going up, benefits being slashed, healthcare systems worsening, infrastructure in general not being improved to a large degree in standards. This can brew and fester into such a degree that you do start to foment these type of politicians. And then in more extreme countries like Argentina, then you do get just politicians who are extreme in their own way, and Javier Milei being almost an anarcho-capitalist in the way that he runs his campaigns solely towards this very rational yellow and black function. The most effective politicians are always ideologues, and they always comprise of an autocracy. The autocracy and its reigning people in power and power system is always set up around these three classes, because to fundamentally understand power requires a certain amount of intelligence, and that to be an implement of power is requisite and correspondent to that. The leaders themselves typically are also very intelligent, and here I've got just a few examples of Lee Kuan Yew, Abraham Lincoln and Franco, whereby they understood the system to the degree that they would be able to manage and control it. Now, Lee Kuan Yew is obviously Asian, so non-Faustian, but his government was based off of what is the UK's ownership of a territory, Singapore, which became independent. So a lot, and he was educated in the UK, I believe. So there's a lot of his understanding about government and initiatives and policies that represent that, particularly free market. But then he also comes with a certain Asian perspective on social conditions. So there's an interesting mixture there, and he was able to grow Singapore from being a third world economy to one of the leading first world economies in just the course of his life, which is a magnitude more of success than almost any politician in our generations, several generations behind us, have been able to do. Maybe Margaret Thatcher could be accounted for, but very few others. So I think it's probably quite interesting to keep an eye out for these ones. These are much rarer men, and typically find themselves being in this Bismarckian realm of statesmen, men who have comprised the state and become sovereign to such a degree that we think of them as almost the eternal sovereign. And this is where you get Kim Jong-un or Kim Jong-il as the eternal commander or president or leader of North Korea, is because you are able to fix in everybody's mind such a strong version and idea and form of the person that should occupy this power, that it becomes you are that person. And if you could tell anyone that after World War II that Franco would maintain power till his death as a fascist or ostensibly fascist politician, where we had an entire war against what we are now told is fascism, but more or less you could see that it was never, the problem was never political in the regards to the type of government. The type of power was what the balance was fought upon. So no one could stand a world-class and hegemonic Germany, because it would have misbalanced the power of both Europe but also globally. And then Russia, obviously, and the USSR subsumed a lot of those Eastern European countries to become its own, a multipolarity there with America as well. But the idea that you have a competing empires in that regard was because it's the eventuality of having what was America, the British Empire, a strong Germany and USSR, all fighting in the one war, and the winners were quite clearly America and the USSR. So you have then that combative and Cold War atmosphere. But in general, I think you can also probably put Stalin to a certain degree in this Bismarckian sense, that he was able to maintain power till his death, and that no Soviet leader after him was able to assume the same level of authority, but also of idealized, and you call it idolatry almost, of we made Soviets and Stalinism such a strong state religion. There's a book and there's a Jesus figure and there's all the ornamentation of a religion to it. It's almost totem-esque in the way that you have representation of everything a religion has, the USSR had, just in an atheistic, irreligious sense. But anyway, this is how we can start to understand autocracies, and a successful autocracy, I shouldn't mention, not a third world dictatorship, which are 10 a penny, because anything like a banana republic or something is not worth talking about politically. These are countries that aren't necessarily controlled by other states. So the idea that Spain was its own, had its own sovereignty to a very large degree was true in the Franco era, and same with Lee Kuan Yew, and then as well with Abraham Lincoln, is that his decision to fight a war against the South, even if it was influenced by the UK and French from a money or arms perspective, was still maintained and fought on sovereign guidance, and so he was still the sovereign there. And so why we get politicians we deserve is because our societies are built towards acceptance of a certain condition at the time. In these luxurious times and decadent positions where everyone is well off, it's very easy to have hopeless politicians like Obama with no policies at all and just maintaining business as usual, because the transition of power is unimportant. We don't really care. It becomes a celebrity contest of we pick the popular person for the way it makes us feel. We don't necessarily care what they do when they're in power, because we're all living such high lives that we know there's not going to be an actual impact to how we live. Now, off the back of that, we obviously saw that the recourse to having such a nonchalant, impotent president like Obama, who was fairly malicious in a lot of the ways that he deployed not just legislation, particularly around securitization of data, and how the Patriot Act was enhanced quite strongly under his guidance, is to say you now have a split culturally, that if a large part of the population would vote for a brown man because he's brown, then you're going to have an idea that the different race cultures in America, and because there's like 3 or 4 of them, will now want representation, and just very visible people like us style representation. So you have white people voting for Trump because he is white, and you won't have people voting for Kamala, or will have people voting for Kamala because of her skin color and her gender. This becomes a very basic and obviously grotesque version of politics, but this reductionism is a natural consequence of the Obama era culture. It's when you start to say the reason we're voting for you is a very basic, you look like us, then everyone is manifestly infected with this brain disease of, well, if you'll do it, then I'll do it, because there's no need for me to try and compete on things above in higher levels. There is no high road now, that everyone takes the low road. You may as well also take the low road. You get nothing out of being gallant and upright and righteous here. So this is the perdition that we're now seeing in real time. It's to say you start to get policy even more meaningless, or policy that's catchphrases to garner specific voters. If it's we want more mining done, that's just blue collar and transitive verbs on exactly, we want people who think that more money for blue collar workers is good. So you don't necessarily have to frack more or drill more oil or explore more oil. The conception to the voter is that, oh, he's more pro blue collar, that is going to get my vote. That's it. So if someone says I'm pro or anti-abortion, it's not actually about abortion in general. It's a very ephemeral and nebulous women's rights issue to say I'm pro or against women. Now, if women choose that this is the issue of the day that decides their voting pattern, then that's what it's been, and you can see here, normified. It's if that's the general perception, is that abortion is the only ingredient to my decision to vote, and if you're pro or against me, then you'll win or you'll lose my vote from that reason. That's why you get the politician you deserve, is because you've encouraged in a democracy very undereducated and very biased people. And it's not to say that people up here are so brilliant that they could never be biased and they would never be waylaid or misled, but it's very easy to derive and to conjure propaganda for this segment of the population, who do comprise at around, at this point in time, something like 90% or more of the population. Voting population is probably slightly less. It might be, say, 80% of the voting population. But when your target is 80% and you know that propaganda works in such a way, the corollary is always that I'll just try and go the lowest degree possible, whatever most basic function of propaganda I can churn out for the cheapest amount of money. And this is why money politics predominated across the West for the last 150 years. Which is to say that the horseshoe theory, it might be quite applicable here, because we can then see, okay, so if money has dominated all the way around to when money no longer matters, is the person brown, then we actually have a reborn and a phoenix out of the fire type of deal, where once we've char-grilled the idea that money can actually do anything, it does nothing. You can have all the propaganda in the world, but if I see someone that I don't like up there on the screen, I won't vote for them. Or if I see someone really, really like, just because of the way that he talks and the way that he makes fun of people, then I'll vote for them. And that's what you will start to see. The next 50, 150 years will be dominated by Caesar types, in the way that they are themselves the party. This is the idea now, that you will have to run on a platform where you have followers, you have people who will buy into your message, and that this middle ground of what you can see from previous electional cycles. So if you do go back and rewatch presidential debates, for instance, from the 50s, 60s, 70s, they're very educated and erudite, and they're centered quite clearly around quite strong policy aims and goals, and the reaction towards both the USSR as an overarching arch nemesis, but then how growth and prosperity can be favorably worked upon with policy measures. Whereas today it's all lip service. It's very clearly like the most basic version of a policy discussion, like the 2, 3, 4 headline words. That's all you need nowadays. Cheaper food, lower inflation. These are the easy ones to just start to maintain a certain element of the populace's attention on, and then they'll thus think, okay, Donald Trump's all about prosperity for making America great again. That means I'll have more money. The policy mechanism to get that is obviously a huge question mark, and you have to see a manifesto, and there's no regard to that for most of the voters, and you're kidding yourself if you think it's important, because your vote as an educated person, assuming you're watching this video, is relatively worthless. So the only ability for you to influence policy decisions is to be a donor class where you have enough money or network or connections to influence the actual politicians, or you become a politician. And this is the way that the ineffectual and despondency you get from politics starts to either eat at you or motivate you. So if you let the defeatism creep into your life on this and say nothing will ever change, nothing ever happens, and you do your chud face, it's going to obviously be a net negative for you in personal, but it'll be a net negative for the broader world if you have something worth bringing that you're no longer feeling you should bring. I think particularly for us as men who try, and women who try to exemplify and be excellent and attribute our life towards maintaining, like I said before, excellence, but also goals and aspirations, and having archetypal heroism as something we would like to obtain, ephemeral or real, then it is something that you must become, and you can only do that by making positive choices rather than, as I say, letting defeatism creep and seep into your being. The next 2 or 3 I'd say, election cycle, so 12 years, will be less important than the proceeding ones thereafter. And I would say, if you are in your 20s or 30s, you are actually benefiting from a time where an extreme position and mentality may benefit you, but only if you can be charismatic and Caesar-like in the way that you hold yourself and the ideals that you possess.